it does have an answer. And there's the answer. Those are the numbers of congregations of different denominations in the greater Milwaukee area. One might assume, because the total population of Roman Catholics in the greater Milwaukee area is larger than the Lutheran population, that the answer might be that the Roman Catholic churches that there are more Roman Catholic churches than Lutheran. Not the case. Often it has to do with the fact that the bishop or the cardinal or whoever makes the decision and says the diocese will be this setting, and we'll have one church to serve that diocese, and it'll be a large one like Josaphat or something. But Lutheran concepts were different because they looked more for neighborhood churches, and sometimes in large urban areas there were ethnic enclaves, and so you'd have the Swedes here and you'd have the Norwegians there, and they had to have their own church because originally the language of the service was in the language of that neighborhood. So there were way more Lutheran churches than there were Roman Catholic and than any other denomination. So the count, that was Tuesday's count, so it could maybe change a little bit, about 120 in the greater Milwaukee area. And as you well know, there are some declining numbers and disappearing numbers. Look at a picture of our Savior, for example, which was recently sold. Come on in. Come on in. And the number of non-denominational, in 68, that could be anything, but those numbers continue to grow. Let's do a little bit of background survey on how we got to where we are. Let's think about reforms in the church. Some time ago, a couple of years ago, just for the fun of it, I took a course at the Episcopal Anglican Catholic, they call it Anglo-Catholic Seminary in Nashotah House, which was entitled The Reformations of the Church. And they chose to focus, we might have focused on the Reformation, 1517, but they were focusing on reformations which had taken place in the church, reforms, movements from the beginning. And certainly there were. In the 16th century alone, we think about Luther's predecessors, and certainly there was influence between some of those and Luther. Like John Wycliffe, I read an article recently which suggested that from Wycliffe to John Huss to Luther, there were some directions which Luther himself claims he followed. So that's an interesting direction. But Savonarola in Italy and the Albigenses and the Waldenses, those were all reform movements which took place. And in addition to that, the Radical Reformation were those people who said Luther did not go far enough. And we want to look at the Sermon on the Mount very specifically, and we want to talk about pacifism. We want to talk about adult baptism and not infant baptism. So today, the Mennonites and the Brethren come from that background and are here in the United States, but that's their heritage, the Radical Reformation. Oops, it says please log in. What happened here? How do we get to the next one? Slide 429. Okay. So from those reform movements, we count today, as we look back, all kinds of church bodies. The astonishing number of 285 billion in the Western Catholic Church, the Roman Catholic Church. So they were separated from the East in 1054, and so that split produces 270 million in the Eastern Orthodox Church. And then in the growth of Protestantism in the 16th century, now counts itself, because it's constantly splitting over and over again into all kinds of little groups, to 920 million. Lutheran churches worldwide counts itself at 76. I missed another 76 million, which is the separated Church of the East. Those are fascinating to me because we frankly don't spend much time looking at them, learning about them. The Thomas churches of India, the Coptic churches of Egypt, the Syrian Orthodox Church. I mean, those are churches which often ended up being persecuted and left in difficult situations, and we've done nothing about it because we don't even know about them. Mm-hmm. A little bit of a focus on Luther's own reforms. The three famous solas, sola gratia, sola fide, sola scriptura. First of all, the belief that God's acceptance of us is a pure gift. There's nothing that we can do to earn or deserve it. It's simply His grace. The trust that this acceptance is our own, is given to us, we receive by faith, and the assurance that this truth comes to us through the Bible. So those were the three emphases of Luther. You can continue to emphasize other aspects of Luther's teachings. Baptism was very important for him, in that it commissions the Christian, that worship should take place in a native language. It was one of the problems in the United States when Lutherans came from all different countries with their languages and worshiped in their languages, and they therefore formed their own synods. So at one time there were 50 synods in the United States. Not all language related, but nevertheless many different ones. Luther's celebration of music and art, being second only to theology, something I treasure, but often when we look at some of the new Lutheran megachurches, and there are such, they, like all megachurches, look like a big amphitheater with nothing in it but maybe a cross somewhere, and maybe an altar and a baptismal font, but otherwise no art, nothing visual, and it looks very much like a Reformed church. Church authority, from Luther's standpoint, was not important. So diaphora in Greek was the difference, and a cancels it out, so no difference. From Luther's standpoint, how you structure the church doesn't make any difference. But interestingly, some of the Lutheran communities in Europe, like Sweden and Finland, chose to practice apostolic succession, and others did not. In Germany, it was not an important issue. And when it came to the United States, it was not an important issue either, until more recently when the ELCA and the Episcopal Church chose to declare fellowship. The Episcopal Church said on one basis, and that is that you practice apostolic succession. And from here on in, you ordain your clergy in this line with bishops who've been ordained by bishops who've been ordained going all the way back theoretically to Peter. So that's an interesting piece of our Lutheran heritage. This is an interesting map because it shows us the religious setting before the immigration to the United States and other countries in Europe. The yellow were Lutheran, and at the time in the 1600s, Sweden and Finland are not separated. So you see Sweden as being one country there, even though on the right side that would have been Finland. So Finland, Sweden, Norway, Denmark, Iceland, Germany, Some of the Latvian countries like Estonia, those were the central focus for the Lutheran Church. Calvinist from John Calvin in Scotland under John Knox, the Rhine River Valley here in Germany, the Netherlands, and some portions of France, the Anglican Church, England, and the Roman Catholic Church, you see, in Portugal, Spain, France, portions of Germany, and and what has become Italy. And then Roman Catholic with Protestant minorities is an interesting one. Hungary, as a result of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, was largely Roman Catholic, but there's a strong Reformed population there, about 1 million strong, and about 500,000 Lutherans. And I remember one time when we took a group of people on a European tour, and there was a very pious LCMS Lutheran in that group who said to the pastor of this Hungarian Lutheran church, "Are you LCMS, or are you related to the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod?" And the pastor, without batting an eye, said, "We are members of the Hungarian Lutheran Church, and our ancestors studied at Wittenberg with Luther. And we have always been Hungarian Lutherans, and we have never been anything else." And I just thought it was a wonderful way of putting the man back in his place. They began to immigrate from Europe for at least 4 reasons: political, economic, religious, cultural. Political, and that varied across the centuries, but one obvious political one would be, for example, when Friedrich Wilhelm III said, because his wife was Lutheran and he was Reformed, he was tired of always going to communion separately from his wife, and therefore he was going to unite the 2 churches, and that meant uniting them in terms of their celebration of the Eucharist as well. Well, there were some people who didn't like that, having a liturgy which was more Reformed than Lutheran, so they immigrated. It's a political example. Economic reasons, many of them was true in the case of my own ancestors who didn't inherit anything because they were not the first son who got the property, but they were second and third and fourth sons, and so they got nothing. And so they heard that there was free land in the United States, and so they came. For religious reasons, there were lots of examples of that, although that's really not as prominent as some people have said. Excuse me. The people who came to the United States often claimed that their ancestors came from religious reasons and religious persecution. That's primarily a myth, because it was more economic than it was ever religious. And cultural reasons. Sometimes they liked to hang on to their traditions, but they knew that their future lay in a setting where they could at least survive economically. I listened to a lovely broadcast last week about Native Americans, and they were complaining about the fact that they were losing their sacred land, and they were losing their heritage, and they were losing their customs and their traditions. Well, I sympathize with all of that. But all of us probably came from places in Europe or other places where we had to surrender that as well. And if we now said, I'd really like to go back to all of that just because I could recapture my clothing customs and my dances and my music and whatever, I don't think many of us would choose to do that. So one has to make their choices. Where did they go, these Lutherans, in the New World? Some to South Africa, some to Argentina, some to Chile, a lot of them to Brazil, Uruguay, between Brazil and Argentina, United States, Canada, Australia. Those were the basic places to which Lutherans emigrated. this is from last week's Washington Post, and there was an interesting article some of you may have run into, which said, why is it that in the Midwest we have so many great orchestras? Well, sometimes the respondents said, well, we have great orchestras in San Francisco too, and in New York. But they were talking about, and unfortunately they totally forgot Milwaukee, but they said, many of them, that the reason is because of Lutheran heritage, and because Lutherans prized music, and because many of the composers were Lutheran. So here you see, blocked out by these yellow lines, the so-called Midwest, and the dark blues where you have North Dakota and South Dakota and Minnesota and Wisconsin and Upper Iowa and bits and pieces of other states, and then of course the light blue. And then my wife and I lived for 20-some years in Texas, and that was kind of an anomaly, because if you would have gone, let's say, to this part of Texas and said, I'm Lutheran, they said, well, what is that? Yeah. But if you went to Austin, where we lived, and said you're Lutheran, within a 50-mile radius of Austin, there were 90 Lutheran churches. Oh, wow. So that was a Lutheran center because of the migrations that had taken place from Germany and Scandinavia. Germans. The era of immigration, and this is all seeking to show us why Milwaukee has more Lutheran churches than any other denomination. The immigration waves that came to the United States came in those three periods of time. The early one, 1600, 1775, 1820 to 1870, 1881 to 1920. I'm a docent at the Milwaukee Public Museum, and my area is Streets of Old Milwaukee. And so the 1870 to 1917 is what Streets of Old Milwaukee focuses on, the third section. The immigration that came to Wisconsin was basically the third wave of that. They included Norwegians, Swedes, Danes, Icelanders, and Finns. We have a granddaughter who is looking at Michigan Tech, which is in the Upper Peninsula, as a college, university to go to. That whole section is populated by Finns, who came 500,000 strong between 1880 and 1900. 1/4 of Norway's whole population came to the Midwest. Most of them were rural people, and they were all Lutheran. Right next in Marquette, Michigan, right next to Michigan Tech, is also Swami Lutheran. I don't know if they've changed from college to university yet.
University.
But
last I read, it was in the university.
It was? Okay, interesting. And I know the president from there, and he often would talk about how he was really trying to celebrate and champion the Finnish heritage of that institution. The second wave of immigration, largely the Germans from Bavaria and Württemberg. They were farmers, but also intellectuals, and they were mostly Roman Catholic. 1865 to 75 from Hanover and Westphalia, again farmers, but mostly Lutheran. 1875 to 1890 from Prussia and Pomerania, small farmers, but mostly Lutheran. My own heritage is from here on my father's side, and from here on my mother's side. So the Pomeranian immigration to Wisconsin was the substantial German immigration to the state of Wisconsin. By 1850, 1/3 of Milwaukee was German, and by 1990, 1/2 of Milwaukee's ancestors were from Germany. So now some of the issues that challenge the church, the Lutheran Church, historically and currently. We've already said the use of multiple languages in worship. That's no longer an issue. Once in a while, you hear that at Christmas time somebody has a German buffet or a Scandinavian smorgasbord or something like that to celebrate the heritage. and maybe somebody desperately tries to read something from an old agenda in a foreign language they can hardly pronounce. But sometimes we look back to that. I can still recall as a child that my father would sometimes go to the Lutheran church when it had a German service because he felt comfortable with that. He grew up speaking German. My mother grew up here in Milwaukee. She grew up being confirmed in German and speaking German. So that's all changed, but that was one of the big reasons for divisions. There was a concern for the different ways of looking at truth, and I can still recall when we were living in Austin, Texas, and we had hired somebody from Milwaukee to come down there and be our director for advancement, development, and this person had 5 sons, and one of them found a girl in Austin, Texas that he wanted to marry, and she was Wisconsin Synod. So they went to visit, and there are 2 Wisconsin Synod churches in Austin, Texas. It's surprising. And so they went to that church, and the pastor said, "We'd love to have you, but just be aware of this, that when you go back to have dinner with your parents or things like that, that when they pray, you don't pray with them." And so the guy came back and he told his father what the pastor had said, and the father said, "Don't ever go back to that church." But that was, those were the differences between some of the Lutheran churches in terms of prayer fellowship, in terms of how you can agree with one another theologically. Much of that's disappeared, but some of that still exists. Well, that's number 3 already. Adherence to the Lutheran confessions. There was a Latin term which was used, quia and quia cum, which meant that we agree with the Lutheran confessions, the statements about doctrine, teaching within the Lutheran Church. We agree with them because they are in accord with the teachings of Scripture, or insofar as they are in accord with the teachings of Scripture. And so there was this difference between some Lutheran denominations on that particular issue. And the administrative roles, that's interesting because some church bodies chose to call their leader a president as opposed to a bishop because they wanted to be American. In the case of the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod, it was specifically because the leader who brought the people over on ships from Saxony got them to anoint him, appoint him bishop on the ship as they were coming over. But then he became a womanizer and he stole the money, and they put him in a boat and pushed him across the Mississippi and said, "Do not ever come back." And after that they said, "We will have no bishops in the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod." And that's how it happened, that they became president as opposed to bishop, even though bishop is a biblical term. The role of women in the church, I'll show you some pictures in a minute. You can tell the difference between some of the Lutheran denominations, acceptance of diverse sexual orientations, fellowship with other denominations. That means, like, for example, the ELCA declared fellowship with the Presbyterian Church, and that's probably the most extreme of the examples where fellowship was declared with churches outside the Lutheran community. And adherence to the government, you see this more in, let's say, black churches than you see it in mainline denominations, where the preacher, the pastor, may want to take a stand on political issues, challenging the people to follow this political leader or that political leader. For the most part, we've claimed in Lutheranism that because of taxation, we want the church and state to be separate, and we don't want to take stands in the pulpit for political issues for fear that the church's tax exemption will be taken away. I mean, that's historically been one of the issues. But increasingly today, people seem willingly, if not in the pulpit, at least in some settings, to talk about political issues that seem to be important to Christians. So this uniting and this dividing was part of our history. The Lutheran word synod comes from a Greek word. The syn is with, and hodos is a journey. So people journeying together. And at one time there was between 40 and 50, over 100. I'm not sure where I got that number, but I've always thought of 50. A variety of different kinds of, so German, Swedish, New York, Pennsylvania Ministerium, all kinds of different divisions, because they came at different times with different ethnic backgrounds, and they began to unite. And today, as a result of this union, you have the largest of them, ELCA, LCMS, WELS, Wisconsin Synod, the NALC, National American Lutheran Church, which formed after there was a split in the ELCA. Then there's a bunch of smaller ones, like the ALC, that's not the old American Lutheran Church, but there's, I can't even remember the names of some of these. I think the Association of Lutheran Churches, there's about 128 congregations, is another one that's like that title with 80 Lutheran. So one split after another, often because the pastor said, we don't agree with those people down the street and we're going to form our own, if not denomination. Didn't start out that way, but gradually more and more congregations joined. Today there are 7.5 million Lutherans, and only 10% of the Lutherans in the world, 7.5 million in the United States, but only 10%, that is, of world Lutherans. So the world Lutheran population is much, much larger than our small contingent in the United States. And I often hear people saying, well, but we're the real lifeblood. We're where the money is. We're the strength of it, We make it possible for the missions to exist. But I've lived in a number of those countries where, through secularism and through a variety of different kinds of political challenges, take, for example, the former East Germany, which was always the more Lutheran of the two parts of Germany, the East, and they going through communism and Nazism, one problem after another, gradually evolved into a setting where maybe 2% of the people would go to church and they'd say, see, those people are no longer Christian. That's often the American condescension. But having lived among them, having read the editorials in their newspapers in which remarkably they argue from Christian standpoints, I have a totally different view of that, which is that you can't always measure the Christian commitment of an individual by whether or not they participate in church, go to church. Because our own participation in communities has something to do with our experience on the plains in pioneer days, when people had nothing but the church to bring them together. It was their rallying point. And now when we are so separated from one another in these urban societies, which we've left for job reasons and other kinds of reasons, we suddenly end up in a new city where we know no one and we aren't part of the church community, and the church communities are really floundering to stay afloat because of changes that have taken place in society. It's my own take on some of that. The impact of all of this on Milwaukee itself. That the parish size is often shaped not by synodical decisions, as in the Roman Catholic Church, but by the neighborhood itself or by ethnic interests. That's been true of different neighborhoods in Milwaukee. I think of a church which is on the expressway as you're going south, and you're going over the valley, and on the left side there's a tower almost right next to the highway, St. Mark's. It was once a German church, but now it's a Spanish. It's a Lutheran church, but it's Spanish. So as neighborhoods change, so often the church changes. Parish size is often shaped by the theology of a local pastor. I was thinking about, this is not Lutheran, but Stuart Briscoe, many of you know that name, who founded Elmbrook Church. He was an itinerant preacher out of England. He had no theological background whatsoever, but he came and he founded a church, and it became a big church. And now there's not just an Elmbrook, but a Northbrook and a Southbrook and a Westbrook and all these satellite churches that belong to it. And so the power of that charismatic personality built that community. Often that happens, but I know of other ones, and so do you, where all of a sudden the pastor of this big mega church has an affair with the secretary, and he's out and the whole thing folds because it was dependent on the personality of that individual. Changing social and economic and ethnic migrations, people move away, people come in and they move out. So you have all kinds of changing situations in urban areas. Once upon a time, it was said earlier that 50% of Chicago had German origins. But the changes that have taken place with the emergence of Latinos, Hispanics, and the giant Polish churches. Today we have 120 parishes which count themselves as Lutheran, many small, many declining, some growing, some becoming megachurches. The three bodies that we know of, all of us in the Milwaukee area, and their affiliates. So Lutheran Church Missouri Synod affiliate is Concordia University, Wisconsin, Lutheran high schools in the area, the Lutheran home in Harwood Place. Those are affiliates of that church body. Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, Carthage College in Kenosha, Lutheran Manor, at least in name, Freighted Lutheran Hospital, Wisconsin, Wisconsin Lutheran College, Wisconsin Lutheran Seminary in Thiensville, Wisconsin Lutheran High School, I think it's 76th Street, and Northwestern Publishing House. So those are examples that make visible those three. The distinctions between them, they are all biblical churches. Whoops, we went too far too fast. All biblical churches, all confess the same creeds, all confess in one relationship or another to it the confessions of the church, the Concordia, the confessional documents of the church. There are some differences with respect to prayer fellowship, how diverse they are in terms of the different ethnicities in the populations, how ecumenical they are in terms of their outreach, what their focus is on social issues. We asked the question about St. Matthew's, for example, about that strong emphasis on social issues, lots of different kinds of areas in which you seek to touch your community, reach out to them. So let's explore that in just a moment. But first of all, this map is fascinating to me, from 2000. So the three colors are the three church bodies we're talking about. The dark green, these are counties. So counties where, not, let's take, for example, North Dakota, which is almost entirely dark green. That doesn't mean North Dakota is almost entirely Lutheran. It means that the predominant Lutheran population in a county is ELCA. Where solid blue, shocking to me, Nevada, the predominant Lutheran population in the counties are LCMS. And Wells, shocking to me that in Arizona, you would have this big stripe. I'm not sure what happened there. Whether a couple missionaries came in there and just went crazy. Because even here in Wisconsin, where Wells comes from, you see a lot of pink, which is not strong red, and you see the red in Milwaukee. But which is even more interesting is the white. The white means no Lutherans reported. So if you came over here in West Texas and said, I'm a Lutheran, they would say, what is that? Because they'd never heard of it. That'd be Church of Christ. But look at here how in the Mid-South and in the South, you have just a scattering of Lutheran emphases. In Alabama, it's interesting that there was a black woman by the name of Rosa Young, who once went out and established in very primitive situations black parochial schools, and from those came parishes. And that's part of why you have this dark blue in Alabama. So, two final slides as we think about where the church might be going, and then let's do some talking about what the challenges are and how we can face them. Increasingly, many churches think of themselves as a community that provides everything: worship, education, childcare, counseling, small group sessions, a gathering place for Christians. So it becomes a compound, it becomes a mega church, it becomes a campus where there's all kinds of services that are provided, everything that you need as a Christian. Transportation makes it possible now to talk about a destination church. Let's say I go to a church in Springer. Oh, that's quite a distance, but I have a car. So I don't, I'm just using an example. So you can go to destination churches because you like it, because there's something there which attracts you, because you have the transportation that brings you there. Whereas years ago that wasn't possible. It would have been difficult. Your horse might not have gone that far. And some people are looking for solid preaching and teaching combined with care for the whole person, the whole family. So it's kind of a Christian clinic where your needs are met and people are willing to be supportive. It's somewhat like the first one, but increasingly you're seeing that in the larger megachurches where they seek to be everything to everyone. Just a couple examples of megachurches, just flash through that. That's nationwide denominational megachurches, so that they relate to an existing denomination. There's a couple Lutheran ones on there, one in Des Moines, Iowa, and one in Hales Corners. These are non-denominational ones you may have heard of. Joel Osteen, the famous TV guy. Willow Creek, where it all really started with Bill Hybels. Saddleback, many people. The Purpose-Driven Life was written by Rick Warren. Many people know that one. The Potter's House, my wife and I, that's in Dallas, and my wife and I once went to church there on a Sunday just to kind of see what it was like. And as we walked in the door, it seats 5,000. I said, do you have like a program or a bulletin or something like that? No, we don't have anything like that. We just wing it. And they did wing it. And then, of course, Elmbrook, which was started by Stuart Briscoe. He died not long ago, I think, last year. And
he has many successors. That's interesting because if we talk about Lutherans today, they don't look a lot different unless you look closely. So way up there, you can see that in that picture, there are at least 3 or 4 women. So that's clearly not Wisconsin Synod or Missouri because they don't have women. In this one, you see one guy in a black robe. At one time, all the Wisconsin Synod wore black robes, and at one time, everybody wore black robes, long before the white all came along. So that's Wisconsin Synod. One of these is ELS, and one of these is Missouri, and I've forgotten which is which, and I don't know that you can really tell. That guy seems to have a black robe on also, as does that guy up there. But they tend to all wear albs and stoles. But who are these guys?
Bishops?
They're bishops, but they're not in the United States. This is Norway. Just as an example, how colorful is that picture? And if I'm not mistaken, the guy in the foreground is new president of the Lutheran World Federation. He's African, and so he's joined them for some kind of picture. Here we are in Milwaukee with the old. So this is Old Trinity, the one that had the fire.
Oh, yeah.
And if I had my druthers, they're in the process of trying to raise $26 million to rebuild that church. If any of you have ever been to Berlin, and you know the Kaiser Wilhelm Church, where they chose, after the bombing, to keep one tower, and next to it, to build a smaller, beautiful, modern church, which accommodates all the needs that people in the modern world have. But this one now, to spend $26 million to try to rebuild that, and to be desperate for funds, I'm not sure that makes sense, but that's a bias. That's St. John's, which is another Wisconsin Synod church downtown. This is Our Savior, which has just been sold, the LCA church. So old churches, changing situations. Interiors, this is the interior of Old Trinity, but you'll never see that again because the windows were burned, and as was the furniture. You recognize this one? That's home. That's St. Matthew's from the balcony angle looking down toward the organ. St. John's, that Wisconsin Synod one, and this is St. Marcus. That's Wisconsin Synod. Modern touches of Lutheran churches, however, that's also changing. This is Walter Memorial on Fond du Lac, which has now been sold to some group. I don't know if it's a black church community or what. I don't recognize the name. Anybody know what became of it? And those are others in the Milwaukee area. Here you see the whole concept of the new megachurch idea of a campus, where everything that you need is there, parking and athletic facilities and all kinds of other stuff. And those are 2 other modern ones in the greater Milwaukee area. Here's a neighbor of yours. Latvian. Once a month they have Latvian. And this is St. Mark's, where they have now Spanish. So changing. Future, smaller neighborhood churches. I don't know how much sense that will continue to make. Changing areas, given the fact that the neighborhoods may well change, probably doesn't justify spending too much money on some kind of a grandiose not megachurch, but a grandiose cathedral in an area that might change. Some areas will be growing, some areas will be declining. Many churches, I know there's an ELCA church on, I think it's Blue Mound, they offer their building in the afternoons to the Mennonites. So there's this diversity taking place where churches are being, well, a building is being served, is serving different religious communities. And then there are churches which focus on just one kind of an emphasis and see themselves as having an outreach to a gay community or whatever. Questions? What are our challenges here? What are our challenges in Lutheran communities in general? I know that John here, certainly as well as all of us, struggle with what are we going to do with respect to music and worship style and language and as we move into the future. To what degree are we going to wrestle with issues that are important, like politics or theology? To what degree is our educational focus going to be just Bible studies, or is it going to be an application on faith life or small group? You know, the Crystal Cathedral that was founded by Robert Schuller grew because of small group Bible studies. That was the whole emphasis of Christian education there, which made it strong. Service and outreach, how will that change for us? In what ways will we focus on one area more than another? What are your thoughts, your feelings about where you're at, where you'd like to be? Given all this that you have in your background, what are your opportunities and your options for the future?
That's what we're struggling.
It's a big question, maybe too big, but
Change is necessary, we know that, but very often the financial aspect comes in because the older people of the congregation are the ones basically responsible for the financial background, and maybe they don't exactly want to do that.
increasingly, as our churches grow, they don't necessarily grow in terms of giving levels at among the younger populations. Sir.
From my experience, a church that's willing to lose itself for the sake of a real sense of mission grows, like Elmbrook. Powerfully mission-driven. It was not self-absorbed about taking care of me, taking care of us as a congregation. The message was almost losing your life to find it and be excited about something different. I think mission-driven has a lot to do with growth.
Good. Other thoughts?
I think one of the things that we like about St. Matthew's is the different ministries. My wife is involved in the Stephen ministry. It's kind of adopting an older person that doesn't have any family and treating them like one of your own. There were several different food ministries where we would go to Cross Church to serve food. We still package meals for repairs of the breach. That's something that's, I think, is really important, not only for the church but for God. I mean, we are really living what He's expecting of us, and that's something that I think we both like about St. Matthew's. Now, I grew up at St. John's, just across the tracks, and as you mentioned, they had when I was a youngster, they still had a German service, and my aunts and uncles, some of them came from Germany and would go to that. But they also practiced what's called close communion. You had to be WELS, or you had to be interviewed before you went to communion, so that they understood what your belief in communion was. Of course, we here know that it's the body and blood of Christ, which is theirs, but they feel that some people have different thoughts. So,
Yeah, those are the divisions that still exist in many settings within our Lutheran community.
well done.
Usher well. Yes, ma'am.
As a rather new person here, it strikes me, the church I came from in the 80s, I joined there in the 80s, and the church I left, or moved from, was also. And I'm seeing it here, it's a very generational community. I was struck last week, I think it was, when the children sang, and it's grandpa and grandma and mom and dad and the children and sometimes great, and they're all in the same pew. What happened in the community I was living in was when the factories of International Harvester and John Deere closed, bam! The generation, my children's generation, left. And they're terribly struggling because they don't have the generations anymore. The children now having children and now having children left.
Yeah.
There were no jobs. And it really changed the community. So I was tearful last week when I saw all the children, because I had that to work with in the 80s, and they left. They needed jobs.
Yeah. That's very true. It's very enriching to see that kind of a cross-generational community that exists here and not at some declining churches.
I was going to say music is very important, music in worship, and we don't belong here, but last Sunday coming and singing Lift High the Cross in the same service as we sang This Little Light of Mine. Just, it was like that kind of that same intergenerational or covering different. So all week I was telling all my friends, like, this was so exciting to be singing those songs.
The blended worship seems to work pretty well for us here. Some other congregations have separated the services, so you've got one service which is contemporary worship and one service which is traditional. What typically happens is that the traditional declines as people get older and the contemporary one grows. So John does a remarkable job having the gift to be able to work with both contemporary music and traditional music, whereas some people don't have that gift. Any final thought, final question?
I believe there still is a Norwegian synod, because a number of years ago, my doorbell rang. I opened the door and it's Wes Heikkinen, one of our engineers that I've worked with. I said, what's up, Wes? You know, you could tell by his name he's Finnish. He says, I would like to invite you and your wife to our Norwegian Synod Lutheran Church. So we talked, but we never did go, but I assume that they're still around because, well, Wes is retired.
The ELS is a Norwegian synod.
Ah.
Quick point on that, however, is that I have enormous respect for people like Mormons and Jehovah's Witnesses and Seventh-day Adventists who often appear at your door to talk, to invite you to something beyond yourself. Because I've experienced all too often that in our more traditional Lutheran churches and other mainline churches, we don't do that anymore. You know, it's not really where our society is at. And as a result, many of those churches are declining because they don't go out and actually solicit people to come in ways that we once did.
They're also the fastest growing.
Yes, well, the Mormons have exceeded the Lutherans by virtue of their door-to-door approach. The next service is about to begin, so we're sending you out.